Hello, I'm Maddie Hale and this is Mad World. Welcome to 2024, the year the world goes insane. 2 billion people go to vote, the US puts itself on the brink of another civil war, and we all watch it through our phones. This week, 2 sweeping laws that could have massive consequences for freedom of speech. One could ban TikTok in the US, and the other could prosecute Canadians for things they haven't even said. Plus, pro swimmer Riley Gaines launches a legal challenge against trans sport. I'll be joined throughout the show to make sense of all of this by former government advisor James Price and The Telegraph's Madeline Grant. Thanks for joining me. This week, a bill passed through the US House of Representatives that would effectively ban social media app TikTok in the country. While it still needs to pass through the Senate, President Joe Biden has claimed that he will sign off on it once it lands on his desk. What this would entail is giving TikTok 180 days to sell 80% of its shares to an American company. If it doesn't, it will be removed from US app stores. For years now, members of Congress, mostly Republicans, have argued that the Chinese-owned app is a threat to national security when it comes to how much data is being collected by the company that could in turn be passed on to the Chinese Communist Party. Now the debate is more bipartisan, so much so that out of the 417 House of Representatives who did cast a vote, 352 were in favour of banning TikTok, while just 65 voted against it. But over 170 million Americans have TikTok, including President Biden. So how well will this news be taken if it were to pass the Senate?
No. What? No, what? Are you... No! No! No!
What's going on? Are you okay?
Oh, I'm okay, Dad. It was just a nightmare. But it's all better now.
Oh. I had a nightmare once. The only difference is I never woke up.
TikTok CEO Xiaozi Chu has denied any information from users' accounts is then passed on to the Chinese government. He said the bill passing through the House was a disappointing vote, arguing it's all misinformation.
A lot of misinformation, and I hope to clarify some things. For the last few years, we have invested to keep your data safe and our platform free from outside manipulation. We have committed that we will continue to do so. This legislation, if signed into law, will lead to a ban of TikTok in the United States. It will also take billions of dollars out of the pockets of creators and small businesses. It will put more than 300,000 American jobs at risk, and it will take away your TikTok.
I want to start with you, James, because obviously TikTok has been a big debate for years. You know, how much data is being collected by the CCP, but it already has 170 million American users on it. So what is the point of getting rid of it now?
And it's absolutely terrifying, the scale that TikTok has managed to grow to. And I think that its growth was probably linked in part, at least, to COVID, to lockdowns, right? Everybody got locked inside just as there was this app that just mines its way into your amygdala. And it's such a low friction to get a new whole world every time you flick the screen. It's a really impressive app in that sense, and you can edit and all these sorts of things. So the two twin worries are really, as we said, there's this idea that it goes back to the CCP in China. And I think that's probably a really valid concern, frankly. It is written into Chinese law that every company that's based there has to have some kind of CCP operative or somebody like that based there. Not just TikTok, but all sorts of other ones as well. They get continuing access to these sorts of things. And here in the UK, we found that government ministers have to no longer have TikTok on any of their government phones. So there's one problem there. But I also just find the libertarian leaving my body when I hear TikTok discussed. Because, you know, in China, what do they have? They have ballet, they have amazing acts of Chinese cultural, impressive superiority, all these things. And what do we get here in the West? Just horror shows, right? The very worst of humanity. And frankly, this kind of brain rot makes me want to be a statist. So if we can ban this and get this out of people's brains, then, you know, we'll find a flourishing of Western civilization again.
I mean, it definitely has kind of contributed to our very short attention span, especially young kids. But I think it should be said that when it comes to, you know, creating large-scale military operations, China has been working for the last decade to launch this fully scaled military operation that can compete against the US, the UK, Australia, NATO in general. They want to create the biggest military in the world. would we be naive, Maddie, to say that they wouldn't be infiltrating other areas of aspects such as cybersecurity, such as social media?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, why encourage this? And in fact, there have been many warnings from defence chiefs, at least in Britain, that I know of, where they have said that TikTok is a liability for soldiers serving abroad because you're then giving away vital information about what kind of weapons you might have, possibly your location, operational things. And it's almost like the whole TikTok has very quickly engendered a whole new mindset in people. It almost goes a step further than sort of even X or Facebook in the past, where you share a bit of yourself. It's almost like everything is constantly being shared. And a video obviously shares a lot more than just a post online or something that's less visual.
And the stuff that does go, well, the users who do really well, say for instance, Alex Earle, an American TikToker, she's posting 4 or 5 videos a day because that's the way in which you grow your audience, is where you're actually posting so much. But going back to what you said before about Facebook, obviously Donald Trump has come out, which has kind of confused a lot of people, because originally Republicans were very anti-TikTok because Republicans are more so concerned about the threat of China, more so than Democrats have at least publicly spoken about. Trump's now scaling back, saying TikTok's not the threat and that it is Meta, Facebook. What do you think about that?
Well, I think this is classic Trump just looking out for himself on these things. Like old school Twitter, pre-Elon Musk Twitter, and Facebook banned Trump from their platforms after the January 6th riots and his sort of supposed complicity or encouragement of all of that. And he really just despises Meta and all those platforms on there. And he thinks they've been biased against him and all the rest of it. And Facebook Facebook obviously owns Instagram as well, which has its Reels function, which is, I think, quite similar to TikTok. Stands to benefit massively if 170 million Americans need to get eyeballs onto these things. Should be noted, by the way, that all of Facebook's products are already completely banned in China and always have been, because Zuckerberg wouldn't agree to all of the horrible communist stuff that the Chinese wanted him to do.
But they're basically all social media from the West, so it's a bit rich to hear them bleating about free expression.
But if we have, how many, I think it was 357 members of Congress voting in favour of getting rid of the app from US app stores, if they're voting for that, and then they've also pushed for, you know, taking away the censorship of social media, isn't that just being contradictory? Is that, if you're a Republican, say more so Republicans than Democrats, voting for TikTok to be taken away from the 170 million Americans that use that, and aren't you just doing the exact thing that you said?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think free speech is vital, and First Amendment, obviously, free speech matters even more to Americans than to most other countries, I would argue. But it's not the only thing. So, for example, you could argue that it has a national security function, that it bleeds heavily into other issues that a state also has to take care of. And this is where I think, go back to James's original point about, you know, being purely libertarian. There are areas where you draw the line, and often, for example, anything involving children is where you'd start to not be purely libertarian, but also issues of national security.
Yeah.
You know, strategic future of the West.
Yeah, and no one in the CCP, no one in the Chinese Communist Party gives a fig about free speech, right?
No.
But their operatives will use it because they know it's important to us. And this is a problem that we see across the West, that our most cherished sacred institutions and values are turned against us. What do you mean we can't use our free speech to say death to the Jews? You know, it's those sorts of things that come to all the time.
Of course.
And again, with this CEO guy, right, this is how I know there's a real problem here. If he could have this company mostly be bought up by Americans, load more investment coming into it from America, free of the shackles or whatever's going on over there, as a CEO, that would be amazing for him, right? So the fact that he's coming out against it means I think there's massively an ulterior motive going on here.
And it should be noted that the TikTok is already banned on government phones in the Biden administration, so they're already ahead of this. But then Joe Biden went and got TikTok.
Also has a TikTok.
So I've said this before on air a few times. That part has really confused me. But we're going to move on to a different freedom of speech debate. It's been billed as Justin Trudeau's crusade against bullying, but his government's online harms bill could turn out to be the most sweeping restriction on freedom of speech that Canada has ever seen. Social media firms will be legally obliged to set out safety plans to reduce the exposure to harmful content. Platforms will have to have 24 hours to remove explicit and sexual content, such as revenge porn or child abuse images. The proposed law, Bill C-63, has provisions to jail Canadians for certain speech crimes. Anyone who advocates for genocide can face life imprisonment, the same penalty as murder. You can even be prosecuted for things that you haven't said. A judge can impose fines and even issue a house arrest warrant if they believe that there are grounds to suspect that someone will commit an offence. Author Margaret Atwood slammed the bill as Orwellian on X, writing, "The possibilities for revenge false accusations plus thought crime stuff are so inviting." Trudeau's Orwellian online harms bill. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal columnist Michael Taub has compared the bill to the film Minority Report. But according to the National Post, 70% of Canadians back action to make online platforms safer, but only 41% believe that this bill will be successful. I'll start with you, James. We've spoken about Justin Trudeau, obviously, a million times. You know, the trio that come on Mad World. But this is up for debate whether this is a good thing. And there are parts of this bill that obviously need to be addressed, not just in Canada, but, you know, in various countries where online harm has been, you know, is sweeping throughout different platforms. But do you think this is another example of Justin Trudeau being a bit of a dictator?
Well, I can feel the libertarian coming back into my body talking about this now. I've got some experience with this in the Department for Education in the UK as an advisor there. You have to deal with these sorts of guys. And different companies do act in different ways. We've just been talking about TikTok. They were very, very poor when it came to various trends happening on their platform. We had one here where they would start accusing their teachers of being paedophiles just to get the reaction out of it, right? That was a real phenomenon that happened here. And TikTok were useless at dealing with it. And you look at someone like Meta, and for all the faults they've got huge teams dealing with this stuff, right? They actually have, from the relevant authorities, real kinds of child pornography that has been caught from bad people, and they feed and train algorithms on it so they know what to spot, and therefore they can spot it and automatically delete all this stuff, right? It's a pretty grim thing, but it's very effective, much more effective, and frankly nicer than having teams of people having to look through all of this stuff all the time if it can be automated. So there's a lot of the stuff that these people can do, but it goes back to a French philosopher called Frédéric Bastiat, who actually Maddie taught me all about, who would say things like, you know, you convince us not wanting something to happen with not wanting the state to go and do it. Right? So the idea that a bit of legislation is just going to be able to do all this and make all the problems go away, it doesn't work like that.
No. And I think that the bill kind of, it's big enough that you look at one part of it and you think that's a great initiative, and then you look at the other part in the fine lines and you say, okay, that's a little bit much. But I want to get into this part where a judge can put you, you know, under house arrest for things that they think that you might say. Now that is a can of worms. How are they going to manage that?
Well, they're not, are they? I mean, short answer, it's impossible. But it opens up, as you say, a can of worms. I mean, how you begin to even deliberate on something like this. It seems like a very fundamental change of law that if they were going to go into in that kind of direction, you would hope that there would be some kind of proper public debate on it, because it really is setting a brand new precedent. It shouldn't be something that is smuggled into a very large, and actually I had a read of the bill myself, and what I found quite remarkable was that, kind of as you were saying there were lots of very innocuous, very sensible sounding bits, and then often kind of buried in quite boring legalistic language were things that you had to read them twice and be like, oh my God, they surely not. It's not the time to be bringing in some sweeping change of precedent into the legal system.
And when it comes to online bullying and it comes to, you know, child pornography and porn, revenge porn or whatever it may be, and, you know, trying to incite genocide or incite various language that should not be online, it is a good thing to do. I remember when Twitter was suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story back in October 2020 before the election, and everyone was like, well, you know, critics would say, oh, you're able to suppress this story so quickly, but you're not able to get rid of all the examples of child pornography and all this stuff. And it's so true. You know, you do find sometimes these social media platforms pick and choose what they think is relevant to get rid of. So I think when it comes to an overall bill for these horrible things online, absolutely. Like it should be down the line, this can't be online. But I think that with that kind of judgment of if someone will do something, you can't really manage that, because I think that the people that will suffer are the people that have been criminalised for certain things, and they'll just be a sitting duck. A judge might say, oh, well, you've done XYZ before, so you probably were thinking about doing this, and then there lies the issue that there's no kind of reform for rehabilitation for criminals.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, the Minority Report comparison, I think, is really apt. It's a very, very dangerous route to go down. What you've got to also watch out for in the desire to push to get this stuff done is that you end up with different laws for people saying something on Facebook or on whatever else versus saying it in the street or in the pub or on a newspaper, right? You've got to have the same kind of laws on these things. And when it comes to incitements for genocide and things like that, obviously those things are terrible.
Yeah.
I kind of want people to say that if it's what they think, because we can flush these things out into the air and see some of the problems that we've got, right? That's one of the advantages of things like free speech. And the other problem of trying to predict when this stuff will happen before it happens, again, it doesn't work with some of the technologies we've got. So a couple of years ago, a black English soccer player, football player, was a subject of huge, horrendous abuse. I think he missed a penalty or something. And loads of people replied with the banana emoji, right? Calling him a monkey. Horrible thing to do, very racist, all these sorts of things. And the Facebook algorithms and stuff didn't pick this up, because it had never been told that bananas equate to monkeys, which is what black people used to be called in a horrible racist way. Didn't get it. So these guys got loads of abuse, but then you train the algorithm and it's, oh, okay, I know to spot those things in the future next time. So otherwise you get kind of stuck in the mode where you can't make any of these things better if you just got a judge deliberating on all this stuff.
Just finally, guys, we've obviously spoken about Justin Trudeau before and, you know, where we're at. I mean, he's heading into election next year, but do you think that this is just another example of him heading down a very, very left-leaning path?
Well, I think that it shows a real arrogance and a sense of almost megalomania that we've come to expect from him. It shows no understanding of the limits of what the state can and also should do.
Absolutely.
You know, the idea that we don't like this thing, therefore we will just will it into not existing. We will have judges that are so prescient that they will be able to work out what someone's intentions are just by kind of looking and guessing, and it's quite right to empower them in that way. And there's no sense at all of like the unintended consequences that can so often happen when the state and the courts are given too much power. So I think it just speaks to the profound arrogance of the man.
It's kind of the new example of the invoking the Emergencies Act in 2022 when he invoked that, and obviously it was the first time it had been enacted, as we've spoken about in the show, since the 80s, or since it was even created in the 80s. And you know, he obviously brought it in to, you know, quell the protests, but didn't really think of the consequences of how this would look to his constituents.
Right, Canada's got all kinds of problems, right? It's got an even worse housing crisis than we've got here in the UK. It's got problems with kind of cultural cohesion. It's got economic issues, all the rest of it. The fact that this guy's only got a few months left in office, this is the stuff he's going for. Is he just auditioning for some other kind of job into the future and he knows he's going to lose? I think it's high time that he gets toughed out.
The ever-growing debate surrounding transgender women competing in female sport has continued this week, with Riley Gaines front and centre. The former competitive college swimmer, along with 15 other athletes, have officially sued the National Collegiate Athletics Association, or the NCAA, over its transgender policy. The official policy allows for inclusivity, provided that transgender athletes document their testosterone levels between a 4-week to 6-month period. The 16 college athletes, however, do not believe in that policy and have filed the lawsuit, citing the NCAA has violated the Title IX, the Equal Protection Clause, and the right to bodily privacy.
What I will say is that the NCAA cannot continue to run from accountability and responsibility and upholding the federal civil rights law that is Title IX. So stay tuned.
Now, this move comes the same week that both Sharon Davies and Caitlyn Jenner, two prominent former athletes, were featured in an article for The Telegraph campaigning to protect female sport. One quote read, "We have such a small piece of the cake and now we're supposed to move over from mediocre male athletes identifying as females." Another read, "Why is it that women are always the ones that have to kind of give in?" Now, we've spoken about this subject before and we've done it a few times on Madwell, but this is interesting. 16 collegiate athletes suing the national kind of body for allowing this to happen. What did you guys think?
Well, I think it's firstly, this is America after all, which is quite a litigious country. So I'm glad that they're doing it the American way and trying to sue the pants off the people who have deprived them of opportunities. But I think it's quite right, because actually, you know, in these debates, there are occasions where, for example, on an occasion, perhaps you may get a biologically female athlete who actually does beat the biologically male athlete from time to time. And obviously that's a much greater achievement for the biological female to have done it. And this is often used as an excuse by those on the kind of pro-trans, sort of anti-biological reality side of the debate. But actually, I often think about, for example, let's say you're in the final 8 of a heat. There was a biological female that wasn't even afforded that place that they rightly earned. These are definitely just causes for suing, and I'm glad that things are going in this way, because the policy that you mentioned in your opener there about how it all comes down to registering testosterone levels. I mean, that certainly doesn't cover the full gamut of possibilities there. For example, bone density is also a very important factor in simple, size, muscle strength, etc. The idea that it can all be determined by testosterone is anti-science,
Which
anti-truth.
is especially when they're playing with the testosterone via whatever, medication or...
Right.
I thought the interesting thing on that point, Maddie, is that Riley Gaines obviously came to kind of national attention when she started speaking out about it. And the reason why she started speaking out about it was because of the race that she versed, the college swimming race that she versed Leah Thomas, who won the race probably more so on length. She's 6'4", and Riley was 5'5", which is what she said on the podcast with Joe Rogan last week, where she just said, look, it's unfair. It's a sport where your height is very much an advantage.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, look, I'm 6'3", and when I play squash against Maddie, she still beats me every single time. So, you can't always...
I'm glad we worked that into the script.
I think that's a you problem, James.
Exactly, that's a me problem, exactly right. But I think this goes to a broader point now, that people are finally not just speaking up, but getting organised on this issue, right? The UK has actually led the way in a lot of these things. People like J.K. Rowling didn't need to weigh into this broader debate, and is doing so. I can't imagine that J.K. Rowling was the sportiest person in the world. She spent too much time in coffee shops writing books about boy wizards. Great on her. But she knows the value of these things, and more people are doing it. And thinking, well, why should I just put up with it, right? If you're a teenage swimmer and you get to be a state champion and all these things, that's a huge amount of work, as Mads points out, right?
Yeah.
And to have all this taken away, why should you just lump it? I think it's great they're getting organised and fighting.
I agree,
back on this stuff.
especially for college swimmers, where obviously you've spent your entire... I mean, Riley, when I listened to her on Joe Rogan, it was really interesting talking about her routine during her high school years and the amount of work that went into trying to get into a university. And obviously a lot of these college athletes are trying to get scholarships as well. So you would obviously feel very disheartened if your place is taken by a biological male. I completely understand. I'm all for everyone doing what they want to do. But I do understand the debate when it comes to trans sport.
Of course. And we talk about this at the elite level. It's very important. It's a horrible thought to think of the amount of work that would go in, say, to a biologically female swimmer just to shave like a tenth of a second off their time. That would take hours and hours and hours for even the slightest advancement. And someone who hasn't put in even a fraction of that effort is able to score a similar time or even beat them. I mean, it's obvious what's going on there. But I think it also has an effect all the way down to sport at a less competitive level, because if little girls see their sporting heroes being beaten and they see obviously biological males on podiums, I think that has an effect on morale. And you've got to think about, the future of sport in general. It's not just a question of athletes at the very top of the game.
But and also swimming is one thing. It's bad enough. The worst thing that could happen, you accidentally bump into the wall or something. But in violent physical contact sports, we're starting to see this happen as well now, right? Play a lot of rugby. If you've got a big, hairy 6'3" person up against a team full of biological women's, right? Or even in proper full contact or anything else, where does this stuff stop? Because if your ideology is, nope, that person is every bit as much a woman as anybody else, then what's to stop that person going into a boxing ring and fighting against a woman and causing serious damage?
That is true. And also, I think from a broader spectrum of, just the kind of emphasis on female sport, it has taken a really long time for people to be interested in female sport. Yeah. They still aren't.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember going to my netball games and my dad would be like, sorry, I've got to watch the boys play rugby. or like, the amount of effort the AFL women's code has taken to get people interested in the women's games over the male AFL games, which is Australian Rugby League, which is everyone is just obsessed with, back at home. So it's kind of just, we've done the hard yards. But I want to read out this quote and get your thoughts on it. One of the quotes from that article from The Telegraph was that men wouldn't put up with it. So I want to ask you guys, if the roles were reversed, and obviously there are examples that the roles are reversed, but if the roles were reversed, do you think that men would be putting up with it?
Well, I suppose it does depend on the sport, because there are some disciplines where there is less of an obvious physical advantage. Like, I don't know, something like archery, for example, versus like boxing. I mean, there's obviously some sports are going to be more affected than others, but you know, in most sports, the involvement of women, frankly, and I'm not saying this, I loved sport as a young person, and I take it very seriously. But there's no way that in my tennis competitions when I was a teenager, if I'd been put in the boys' round, it wouldn't even have made any difference to them whether I was there or not. However, the alternative would have completely undermined every female tennis tournament that I played in. I mean, that sort of implies that women and men are exactly biologically the same. That's not the case. And sometimes that can lead to something rather wonderful, the fact that women's tennis is actually a very different sort of game to men. They play it differently. I know people who prefer one or the other. You know, you can make your choice, but what you can't do is merge them together and pretend it's exactly the same.
Or at least mixed sport is an amazing thing to do. To play mixed sport in general, not at an obviously competitive level, it's great. I loved the thought that, you know, men were keen to play a game of netball with the girls. It's great. But I do think that this will become a more contested subject going forward, because I do think that there are probably a lot of women who are kind of hiding in the shadows, concerned, but not ready to voice their opinion for fear it might, you know, be an anti-trans remark, when I don't think necessarily voicing concern for, you know, an equal playing field in a sporting code I don't think that's anti-anything. I think that's just standing up for your rights. But I guess that's all the time we have for, guys. That's all from us on Mad World this week. Thanks to James and Madeline, and thank you for watching.